Hi, everyone. This is Anthony Costello, and I'm here with Jacob, Josh, and Logan, and this is the Equal Justice Podcast. The Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. And in part three of our little roundtable discussion here, we're going to be taking a look at one of the very hot topics of our times, critical race theory, which is throughout the academy and not just in the academy, but certainly in popular culture. And Jacob, one of the things we wanted to start with on this issue of what is critical race theory, how should we approach it, how is it affecting the church, is by taking a look at a recent statement signed by 6 of the presidents of the Southern Baptist theological seminaries, condemning critical race theory as an analytical tool for how to understand race and racial justice and racial reconciliation. So why don't you get us started, and then we'll just go from there.
Yeah, one of the bravest attempts that's been made recently, I would say, is these 6 Southern Baptist Convention seminary presidents coming out and condemning CRT, critical race theory. And I think it was a product of an engagement that they've had in terms of the statement that came out a few months ago, seeing a kind of leaning more towards the whole idea of adopting CRT as an analytical tool. There was some credence being given to CRT as an analytical tool, as well as the whole idea of intersectionality and acceptance of that within the framework of how church functions. So I think when these presidents came out against this idea, it was well thought out and very timely. It came at a time when, so a lot of people have been asking, okay, they're saying these things. What is it that they're proposing in terms of action? So I've been telling people that the very fact that they condemned it is an action towards aiming for that which is good for all at all times. So I would say our listeners can go online and look it up, read the whole statement that these presidents have made. It's a bold step towards, I think what they have done is they've shown themselves to be a beacon of light for many institutions who can follow through and basically go along with them in terms of recognizing the danger that it poses to the church.
One of the things that I saw that was a little upsetting, I suppose, because, we've all seen either in our own churches or certainly online the kind of division within the church that these discussions on critical race theory have caused, right? Where, you have a large portion of the evangelical community wanting to embrace critical race theory, kind of in its secular form too, right? Not like a critical race theory that's been sort of filtered through the Bible and the history of Christian theology, but that, this is like, the new ideology, the new philosophy that we all have to embrace. And then you have, those that are resisting that, calling it, like these presidents. And one of the things that was a little disturbing was, most people on this who listen to this podcast, if they're evangelicals, will probably be familiar with Phil Vischer, who's, done a tremendous service to the church over the years with all of his work with, for kids ministry, with Veggie Tales back in the day. And then my kids, we've used a series with my kids called What's in the Bible with Buck Denver, which is great. It's these puppets basically singing and walking you through from Genesis through Revelation. It was an excellent series. It's probably about 5 or 6 years old now. And I would highly recommend that. But Phil Vischer's been coming out and speaking a lot more explicitly on things political. And I'm sure he's we know he's very well connected, but I was watching one of his recent podcasts with sort of some of his team members. I don't know any of them as sort of academics or scholars. I think one is a pastor, the other was like an MDiv student. You know, and what bugged me was the sort of immediate stance, and the topic was, these 6 seminary presidents coming out against critical race theory. Now, it is just so happens to be the case that all 6 of these presidents are white heterosexual males, which already provides sort of the cannon fodder for anybody who's wanting to embrace critical race theory, because that's part of the game. But what was noticeable was the initial reaction from Phil Vischer and his team was kind of like, these guys are idiots. Like they don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand that, and the one woman who I think was an MDiv student or somewhere. I'm not saying she wasn't smart, but she was trying to point out look, Christians throughout history have always adopted extra biblical philosophies, to shape theology, which is, that's we all know that because it's a truism. But the idea there was that she thought she knew this, but these 6 heads of seminaries, these 6 presidents, include, one of them who is Al Mohler. And if you've even seen pictures of Al Mohler's library, it's bigger than most university libraries. And to think they didn't get that, they weren't smart enough to see that Christians oftentimes have used, other philosophies like Platonism or Aristotelianism to enhance their theology. And these guys were just too dumb to see that we could do that with critical race theory. And it was that kind of approach. And look, maybe that's where we all need to be humble. But, this idea that these guys probably hadn't thought it through, before they came out with their statements.
I think it's a common attack, yeah. And one thing they fail to understand is that over the past decade, I would say, if you just go and Google some of the videos and interviews and discussions that they've already had with scholars, reputed scholars on these issues, it's not that they were just coming and beating the air for no reason. No, they were doing it intentionally, knowing where the truth behind these ideas and how to engage with it. So to blame and to basically say that they are not credible enough in terms of their academic pursuit.
Right. And it's not to suggest that one can make the logical fallacy of appeal to authority and say, oh, well, because those guys are seminary professor or presidents, they must be right. But it's to take the stance they didn't even look at this kind of. They just, because they're white guys, they came out and immediately condemned it without even reading about it. Yeah. Where, I benefit of the doubt would be Al Mohler's probably read every single one of these books on critical race, or at least most of them, or he's got a team of people working on them, and the other presidents as well. And that these guys just didn't willy-nilly sort of issue this statement, so that's where I found it interesting. Yeah. These very popular speakers, though, people like Phil Vischer, who have a broad reach to a lot of people, are willing to kind of take a very flippant attitude towards people who really do probably know better.
Yeah. And the question that just comes to my mind is well, what, at the end of the day, what is the reasoning on, each side of the aisle? And Logan, you were mentioning this earlier, if the claim is that CRT has value because it's and this is what I hear often from, especially in the church, from other Christians, it has potential, or it has value in the fact that it can help us see through another lens. So for example, when you read scripture with a feminist lens and a feminist hermeneutic versus a CRT kind of hermeneutic versus maybe a more postmodern or modern hermeneutic or what have you, just putting some kind of label there and looking through that perspective, we can have a more holistic view because we have more perspective than if we just have looked through this traditional perspective. That's how it's been, that's the way that it's been described to me. But I guess my question would be what value is that? And then I think we also need to adhere to what Al Mohler and the rest of these seminary professors are saying, or presidents are saying, which is some of the dangers that are inherent to it as a worldview, which is different than it simply being a sociological analytical tool which we can utilize.
Yeah. Go ahead, Logan.
Well, there's like there's a lot to cover on even just with what you three have just said. It's like the whole question, like, so with Phil Vischer's podcast there, that Tony began with, I just finished reading a book by Shelby Steele's White Guilt. Highly recommend. It's a little reading group. I probably mentioned it before, that a group of us we're doing each week. Read a couple chapters, and we try to cycle between more of a leftist view and then a far right. And there are things we've noticed. For example, the vanguard of the Black academics, conservatives, were formerly these leftist Marxist theorists. They're really very much into this kinds of stuff. But one of the points that Steele makes that was very fascinating, because this book's written back in 2006, I believe, is that there was a shift from principled reasoning, or reasoning and principles, though that was sort of a currency in which people engage with, to now a question of association versus disassociation. And as you said, Tony, right from the beginning, you see that playing out. Oh, these are just a bunch of white, straight, heterosexual males. There's the power of association, disassociation. The speakers in the podcast, they're probably white. Phil's white. Yeah. Is saying, look, we're going to disassociate from this racist past. This is Shelby Steele doing this analysis. And we're going to look at these people and say, but they're part of this tradition and the principles of racism. And now on this, we'll kind of pontificate what we think is wrong with these individuals. And as you said, Tony, with someone like, Al Mohler, who is going to look at the principles, looks at the worldviews, what is it doing? And this is where, like what Josh was just saying regarding whether or not it's a worldview or not. I mean, you have people like John McWhorter, who's a Democrat, non-Christian linguist, saying it looks like Christianity, but not Christ. It's this weird sort of quasi-religion. So it's not just these white, straight men saying, look, this is a worldview that's antithetical to the Christian gospel. You have Black men who are Democrats saying this is very quasi-religious.
Well, and I gotta get this in, because this is where, this is another been frustrating thing, is the evangelical echo chamber. So you got all these white evangelicals who are leaning left, but they're only talking or reading. Well, I'm not saying all of them. It's a hasty generalization. I get it. But it's like, are you even looking at the gay, atheist, Black guys, intellectuals, who are saying that CRT is incredibly damaging, that it's ushering in the death of the academy and the university? And then, I'm saying, like, I'm thinking of everybody from John McWhorter, who, like you said, he's a liberal atheist, he's an avowed atheist, to maybe people like a Douglas Murray, or an Andrew Sullivan, who Andrew Sullivan led the charge as a public voice to for the same-sex, for the advocacy of same-sex marriage, and was a leading voice in getting the Obergefell-Hodge decision. And he's come out and written, and he's been fired from positions, and he's been lambasted by that. He's come out and said that this is a religion. Or, then you add in people who maybe are more friendly to Christianity, but who aren't necessarily explicitly Christian, like a Glenn Lowry, but who's like a very well-known and highly regarded economist, but certainly not an evangelical Christian, at least as far as I know, who says that, and when he was being interviewed on Al Mohler's podcast, talking about social justice and critical theory in the university, that, and I quote, "It is a threat to our civilization." And then you wonder, well, so, what is Phil Vischer or some of the other white, more liberal evangelicals, why aren't they accessing these people's thought on the issue? Yeah. So yeah, because it's not like you have to go find somebody within your particular religious tradition who's resisting critical race theory. There's
Yeah.
plenty of voices.
Well, and this is where I think, if listening to you talk about Phil Vischer, and when they're going off on,
And we'll get off of Phil Vischer in a
yeah,
minute.
well, this well, it's going back to the seminary presidents. If you're going to, and I've had this conversation so many times with so many people, sometimes I forget who I've had it with. You have to know what they're claiming and what they're disavowing. And a lot of what I've gotten to, conversations with these social scientists, they'll say it's not a worldview. Critical theory, based theory, is a methodological lens by which we can analyze the world around us, and then they'll kind of cash it out in terms that most people would accept as worldview defining. And what you see is, look at, there's Adam Greenway. He said something to the effect that it's antithetical to the Bible that the gospel is the only thing that can save. Now, these social scientists are looking at, they don't get critical race theory. But what they're not seeing is, okay, but what are they responding to? Is the claim that they're just making this up? Or what's the relationship to the church? How are these individuals living this out? When you read people like D'Angelo, it's a worldview. Without a doubt, it's a worldview. And the question then becomes, there it is. There it is. We
do read these books, people.
This is not a paid advertisement.
And I'll get to this one. I'll get to this one shortly as well.
Yeah. It's, what are they disavowing? And this is where I don't know if before we started recording, I was brought it up with Josh, and I don't know if the social scientists are still living out the wounds and scars from the logical positivists, which just cut all social scientists at their knees and said these are all fake sciences that are, they do their own thing, but it's all a language game, and however you want to cast out, but it's not actually getting at the world. And so I don't know if these social scientists are running in to defend it's an analytic objective methodology, because this might be the first time that they become popularly relevant, versus physicists and chemists who had a very well-established history of being relevant and objective, and so on and so forth. So there's this part of, what are these Baptist seminary presidents saying? And then the other side is, okay, what are these social scientists trying to defend?
Well, and I think that's
one
a
of the ways,
huge point, Logan. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jacob.
No, I was saying, as Christians, the warning for us is to not buy into the narrative that you can actually discuss or engage with the evils of oppression only within the framework of CRT. I think that's something we need to be aware of. And we need to look at CRT not as a dissected ideas, but as a holistic idea that concerns with the origins as to where it starts and the kind of meaning it tries to provide and where it wants to take the society as a whole. In that regard, we got to see this as a worldview that would impact all aspects of our life, right? It doesn't leave anyone or anything outside of it. It sees everything through the lens of oppression, oppressed and the oppressor. And we need to actually get away from that and not buy into, as I said, this very narrative that's been trying to, in all, especially through the media and other mediums, right? This is the very narrative we're getting, that this is the only framework or tool that we can use.
Well, that's where,
actually,
I wrote a long essay. C. Stephen Evans, who should be familiar to everybody here, who's a philosopher at Baylor, excellent philosopher of religion and of ethics. He calls it, he wrote an article for Ratio Christi. I don't have the issue here with me, but talking about a universal hermeneutic stories, right? And he talks about there are systems that human beings create, right, that seek to explain all human phenomena. He talks about the big 19th century stories that were created to explain everything were, Freud's theories, Nietzsche, and Marx, right? And you could probably add Darwin into that mix as well. This is how we can explain everything. Well, as soon as you have something that reaches what I would call, what I wrote in an essay, a global hermeneutic like this, then it's just going to be in competition with biblical Christianity, because it's a whole nother story that's trying to explain all the human phenomena through a particular lens.
Yeah.
so are we. We're trying to do the same thing, and we think our story's true.
It's not just
Well,
that. Not just
Yeah.
that, like that it's trying to explain everything. It's trying to explain everything in moral terms. You know, this idea of oppressor, or they're not morally neutral terms.
It's not like the
physics or
scientific
something, or
worldview. Right?
biologies.
It's not
well,
the
They're not.
that's
Where the
the
terms are
irony of it.
not.
Yeah, it's more than
That-
description. Right.
That's the irony
exactly.
of it is CRT is I would classify a postmodern movement,
Yeah.
which is why you're seeing some of the modernists, like you said, what was his name? Andrew
Sullivan.
Andrew
I mean,
Sullivan,
Jordan
that was it.
Peterson would be another
Yeah.
obvious voice of reason.
Which is why you're seeing even a lot of these the modernists, like these atheistic Darwinist, right, secular liberals who are clashing with this CRT movement, because it's kind of this what's been in place has been this modernist view, but it's being replaced by a postmodern intersectionality, dividing into different narratives, looking through different narratives. But the irony of it is the fact that CRT is now becoming the dominant narrative, and they're claiming objectivity to it while attempting to cling to the postmodern lens. And so I think the issue here is you can't have it both ways. You can't say like, hey, I'm a relativist, but then also try to say, well, if you disagree with this framework or this narrative that I'm holding on to, you morally are in the wrong, which Logan, to your point, is being implied. I think that's part of the problem is it's like, okay, if you're saying this is just simply a tool and a framework and a sociological maybe or methodological way of slicing up the world, and that's it, then that's one thing. But once you start implying that moral terms into it and saying, well, if you don't adhere to this view that just to give an example, like there needs to be 50-50 split between men and women, right, in a workforce, or there has to be some kind of especially in terms of like equal outcome, right, between like races or gender or what have you, you're now saying that the other person is in the wrong for disagreeing with this particular narrative that you're portraying. So it's like, which one is it? And I think, Logan, again, going back to what you were saying with what is it that you're claiming, and you're getting a mix of claims, and so you kind of get this chaos. And it's like, I think from an individual perspective, you have to address the person who is adhering to CRT one person at a time and say, like, which one are you holding to? Are you holding to more of the postmodern, this is just my personal narrative or a tool that I'm using? Or are you saying, hey, here's a moral implication of this, which from my personal perspective is becoming more and more prevalent. I think you're seeing more of that, of now, if you disagree with this, you are bad, or you are in the wrong, or what have you.
Which is, like we said, going from wholesale to retail. We're taking the theory, and now this dog has teeth. We're not just making a descriptive statement the way maybe the advocate of scientism saying, well, I'm just describing the world. Whatever you're going to do, go do it. I don't care. But now this is, here's this theory, and then, and here's what we're going to do about it, which is the Marxist impulse to take the theory and make it actualize it, right? There's philosophy in the abstract is worthless.
And also it's very presentist. It's also very presentist. It doesn't take much care of history. As I was saying, seeing this as the only lens through which we can understand oppression, we're disregarding the whole history that Christianity has contributed around the world in terms of freeing people and setting them free from oppression around the world, not just to a community or a group of people. There's a disregard for history. There's a disregard even for future in terms of not being precise as to where is it that we are heading as a community. That's why the whole idea of bring this monument down now, bring this person down now, cancel them here and now. We don't want to engage with ideas. We don't know how to engage. There's no time for it. I mean, and that's dangerous. And that's not the society, that's not what Western society was built upon. We are built upon the idea that we can set our truth or ideas of truth on the table and let truth prevail. And I think that's what has built the Western civilization. And as you said, it's a threat to the very fabric of the Western civilization. We are losing the soul by adopting this very framework.
Well, you know, Jacob, there is a long-standing strain in theology that only God can actually create anything, right? Man can rearrange what God has created. We can create the new forms, right, through the matter that he's created. But the devil's job is to destroy. And, right, I mean, if you go back to Augustine, you have the privation understanding of what sin is, that sin is a privation of the good. You know, I'm teaching through The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce with my class right now. And then we did Screw Tape before that. You know, and it's all about Satan distorting, deconstructing, destroying what God has created. When you get these destructive forces, to sound a little Freudian, where, yeah, there's the sense of, oh, we need to tear all this, we need to tear this mother effer down, which is becoming a common thing, even for Christians to speak like this. We need to tear this thing down. But what we're going to replace it with is like, I don't know. Because
and you know, when we talk about oppression, we need to be asking, okay, where is its origin? What is causing this oppression fundamentally? If one is adopting the critical race theory framework, they'll have to conclude that the basic idea underlying it is that human nature is innocent by fundamentally. It's blank slate. We get corrupted by the system. Therefore, we need to deconstruct the system. And that's completely contrary to what the scripture teaches. There is in CRT no basis for redemption, no basis for atonement, as we were talking about earlier. You know, the issue is with the group, the collective, the system that needs to be dismantled and replaced with another system. And as you said, they would not come to this language of replacing it with another system because the other system would look exactly the same, grabbing power from someone else and possessing it. That's the basic idea behind critical race theory. So those who are adopting it as a tool, I would say they need to explain as to how they are dissecting it from the fact that fundamentally in its origin, it is questionable.
Yeah, and especially as Christians, I think that needs to be known, like, that if you even want to claim it as a tool, right? And you're saying, okay, we're not claiming this as a worldview. We think it has certain things to offer. Well, then denounce some of those core tenets, like the fact that as a Christian, we can't hold that human beings are innocent. I mean, Jesus said, "I came to for the sick, not the righteous." If we're innocent and we have no moral failures, or if you know, deep down we're really good, we don't need redemption. That's completely antithetical to the gospel. So I think go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're
I was just gonna say,
yeah.
I think it's like, okay, fine, if you want to use it as a tool, great, but then denounce those aspects of the CRT worldview. And also, and I'd like to hear how are you holding to it in a way which you know, maybe affects your hermeneutic, or in which you're able to, you know, be woke and see certain things that others can't because you have this methodology. I just think if you're going to go that route, there needs that, you need to have that conversation. I think you have a moral responsibility as a Christian to say that, because otherwise you are leading people away from Christ, and from the opportunity for the gospel to take root and have an impact. I mean, Christianity, like, is a competing narrative, right? As far as its views on suffering, its views on oppression, its views on redemption,
ultimate goods.
Ultimate
goods that one should or could attain, which are spiritual goods.
And one of the fundamental things is the common good, you know, that is promoted within the Christian worldview, right? It's good for the it does not exclude a people group, exclude an individual from the common good, but collectively takes everyone into consideration.
Well, see, I was wondering this recently, and I was going back and forth a little bit on Facebook with somebody I think studies this issue from a little bit of a different angle than me. But, you know, if you take like Romans 1:18-32, which is, you know, the go-to passage for anything worldview consideration, right? Where Paul talks about this great exchange that we make between the creator and the creature, right? And if that's now, he mentions four-footed animals and physical concrete objects that people will worship over the creator. But it's been the history of theologians and philosophical theologians to also understand that we can exchange ideas for the creator. We can exchange ideologies, isms, if you want to put it historically, all the isms out there. I mean, it seems to me that, what critical race theory might be the hermeneutic too is an elevation of race itself as sort of like our fundamental and primary and only identity. And then, again, it's not the creator we're interested in. It's this aspect of his creation, our racial identity, that is ultimate. And then CRT just acts as the way to see everything as an aspect of racialism, if you want to create a word.
Well, and that's what I think.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm hitting on the same point again, and maybe this will be a little bit clearer for the audience. But also, I think this is sort of the big controversy, and the church is going to have to deal with this. And I think if they go down this particular path, it's going to be an atrocity. Josh brought it up, is a lot of people respond saying, okay, I don't want to take the worldview building aspect. I don't want to take the moralizing aspect of critical race theory. I just want to use it as a methodological lens. But I don't think that the methods or the tools built into that method can be cashed out in any other way than moral terms. I mean, look at it this way. If I was trying to decide whether or not I thought relativity theory or Newtonian mechanics was the theory to believe in, right? And I said, okay, Newtonian mechanics is best. And someone's like, no, relativity theory has a better description. There's no moral crime that's being necessarily committed. You just say, well, run with your Newtonian mechanics, and you will find if you try to build certain things to account for certain problems, it's not going to work. It just won't function. But there's no moral outcry. This guy believes in Newtonian mechanics, right? Look at biologists when they're talking about viruses. The virus isn't, we think, because we see a lot of bad viruses right now, we think of the term virus as a inherently negative term, but it's not. It just describes a particular kind of organism and how it functions in relation to other organisms. When you talk about critical race theory, oppressor oppressed is not a morally neutral term. It's not. If I denied a theory of critical race theory, in their view, I'm denying moral things and moral terms and moral judgments and this whole collection of what's right and what's wrong in the world in a particular path forward to make a better, morally good society. It's just fundamentally worldview because it's holistic, but also because it's totally moralized.
Yeah. One of the examples that I use, let me see if it makes sense here. I meet a lot of people here who basically support the idea of doing yoga, right? And Christians also do yoga. And I ask them, okay, why do you think doing yoga is fine? And they would say that, oh, see, we don't actually do all those postures that worships different elements and different gods. Like there is something called Surya Namaskar. We don't call that. We don't do that. They would do all the stretching and everything that would look similar and everything, but they are not worshiping ultimately the God, to which, and because they're not calling it that. Whereas they don't hesitate to call it yoga. The very term yoga itself means actually you are becoming union with the ultimate reality. And they say that, oh, we are only doing stretching, but calling it yoga. So what I'm saying is that stretching pre-exists the idea of yoga. The term yoga itself means that you want to become one with the ultimate reality, and thereby adopt this idea of oneness, not duality as it exists in Christian faith. So similarly, I think this idea of engaging with oppression, taking care of justice, taking care of the oppressed, these ideas pre-exist the very origins of the idea of CRT. Now, one wants to, just like stretching and replacing it with the term yoga would denote to something. And I don't think we should, as Christians, be doing that with CRT. We have other framework that we have historically worked with, and God has used that to bring about more freedom and justice in this world. And there is no need to actually replace that with a framework that is fundamentally flawed in its origin.
Right. And I think, Jacob, I think you could say that is also probably a reason why, look, I mean, you can say that there are always extra biblical philosophies of the day, some of which we appropriate in order to develop our theological understanding, right? We would say that Augustine was very aware and willing to apply Middle Platonism in some way, that obviously Aquinas's project, the great synthesis of the Middle Ages, to take Aristotle and try and understand at least some of what the Bible was saying through Aristotelian categories and terms. Like we understand this is done. But that's also not to say that every or any old philosophical system is equally as correct, as equally as right, or as equally as compatible with the biblical revelation, right? And I don't think Aquinas or Augustine ever would have said that, hey, you know what? In order to understand the Bible, order to know that the Bible is true, I really got to understand Plato. Then I can say whether or not the Bible's true, or what the biblical revelation is. You know, the philosophy is there for us, or the social science or the data that's out there is there for us to try and contextualize for the culture we live in what we know as revealed truth, right? But there's always going to be a balancing act there. And I think when you get, I mean, look, Union Theological Seminary, which is always at the forefront of every modern day heresy, you know, I mean, look, they came out and said it in I have the text saved somewhere, where critical race theory, maybe it was critical theory more generally, is the tool by which we know what in the Bible is true and what is not. So there you go. Now you have your philosophical system that adjudicates what is inspired revelation and what can be thrown away and left to the dustbin of history, because Paul didn't really know what the hell he was talking about on sex, right?
I mean, that's the very basis of liberation theology as well.
Well, and that's what I had the conversation with my friend Ed at Sacred Heart Major on correlation theology, and I do think at the academic, if you whittle your way through a lot of the critical race theory stuff that's in the church, you're going to get some kind of correlation method of theology that, you know, we're in dialogue with the Bible, and we can take critical race theory and we can apply it in such a way where it will tell us what parts of the Bible are important and relevant for us today and which ones are contingent, and we can relegate them to the past. And they're just not, we can ditch them. We don't need them anymore.
The only problem with that is you have to ignore the Bible itself in order to do that. I mean, the Bible speaks towards itself. And
that's not the only problem. There's tons of problem with that, because what happens with the next philosophical system that overtakes critical race theory? Now you got to revise your whole theology again, over and over.
I think this is where Jacob's example of yoga versus stretching is a good example, and probably something that most of the audience, and I think most of the church, should be able to understand, is the question of, is it stretching or yoga that comes first? And with what you're saying, Tony, if it was Augustine or Aquinas, what came first, theology or the philosophical lens in which that was being interpreted? Right. And it was the theology came first, and the question is, okay, there's certain concepts or certain truths we're trying to hash out. We don't have a clear understanding of this. And then that's where they look at other concepts and go, oh, this could help us extend or clarify what we're already dealing with. And then so there was already this like theological prior commitment. So in Jacob's example, yoga never interpreted stretching, right? Stretching came first. Yeah. And then there was this worldview that could have been added later or filtered through this question of stretching. But if yoga ever started defaming stretching or made horrible, dangerous stretching moves, stretching would come first, right? And this is where it's just another critical race theory. And this is what goes back to the presidents. They're denying that it's not just this lens that's able to adjudicate theological problems, but it's being used to interpret new theology and denoting new concepts that aren't necessarily found at all within those scriptures.
Well, and I imagine too, Logan, if you look carefully enough, going back through the lineage of where critical theory itself emerged, going back to the Frankfurt School and even before that, at the end of the day, I think you're going to wind up at Hume and Kant with regards to metaphysics and epistemology, right? So now you have a tool that I think is grounded in metaphysical and epistemic skepticism that takes a strong anti-realist stance, anti-realism with regards to metaphysics and maybe even moral values and duties. Everything is a construction of the human mind. This might not be the best thing to use as a tool. Aristotle and Plato were a lot closer. Maybe we could
especially given that the Bible isn't epistemologically and metaphysically skeptical. It makes these claims, or claims that we could cash out in metaphysical or in epistemological language. Yeah.
Right.
Antonio, there's one thing, there is a warning here for the church. And this is something not just people in the church, but also outside the church must look back in history. And the very origins of cultural Marxism was, its origin is in the failure of economic Marxism, right? That's where the question emerged as to why did we fail there? Right. And thereby, it's a clash of worldviews that was the issue. And thereby we saw that it's the social capital that we need to actually generate with the grabbing of power. And if we see we should be questioning as to why economic Marxism failed and resulted in the killing of millions of people. Can we afford to do that? I believe, even with this social Marxism that is actually in the garb of critical theory that has come about. I personally feel that there is a danger if you're not analyzing the history of economic Marxism. We'll end up dehumanizing people, if not killing of those who are labeled as oppressors. And that's a warning for the church. That's something that we should be analyzing in terms of knowing where we are heading. Is it worth adopting a theory that has an origin of it in a place that has resulted in destruction, right? Even though we're trying to change this whole narrative, which is being, in some way, we are escaping that very narrative in history in order to create a new one. But I think it's an old system in a new garb. That's what it is, and one has to be careful as to where it will lead us to.
Well, and Josh, I feel like I cut you off earlier. I mean, I'm sorry. You had maybe a thought you were trying to finish.
No, you're good.
I mean, Jacob, and one thing is I have a very, very good friend. I mean, great friend, great man who's much more liberal on politics than I. He's doing his PhD right now on the hermeneutics of the scholastic theologians, Aquinas, Anselm, and Bonaventure. And we talk about this a lot. And this is something with regards to critical race theory, where I don't see necessarily why Christians who may lean a little bit more liberal or left on politics, why those of us who lean more conservative, we should still be able to lock arm in arm on this. I mean, there are plenty of classical liberal voices out there. We mentioned some of them earlier, John McWhorter, Andrew Sullivan, Sam Harris, right, has come out very strong, who, and conservatives. I mean, this is the kind of thing that liberals and conservative Christians on other issues, we can get together on this. That even if you have different political views on other things, doesn't mean that this is something we can't sort of tackle together and rightly condemn or at least strongly critique together. It's got dangers in there that I think are lurking. That, I mean, it's just going to be, it's just incredibly divisive. And if we get to it, I'll lay out these 6 points that I came up with that I think if you really took critical theory to its practical, logical extent, I think you're going to have to do some things that I think half the people who embrace it in theory, maybe not even more than half, they'd never do this. They'd never do the actual practices that are being, forced upon us or attempted to be forced upon us.
Yeah. Well, last Sunday, I mean, I gave a little sermon to a group of high school students, but we were just giving a summary of Paul's letter to the Ephesian church, or to the Ephesians rather. And this goes to the critical race theory, and let's just use the methodological lens. Some of the major points that Paul makes is, first, that there's a reorganizing between Jews and Gentiles that's happening. The group identity he attacks in this way. There's no longer a thing. Don't do this. So, this is kind of the effects of the gospel. And the second thing he does, he gives this very good, I think relevant example. He talks about the master and the slave and their relationship. And he basically tells them, but remember, both of you guys have the same master, which is Christ, in which how you treat each other should be in reference to the commands and dictates that Christ has given us. And so this idea, but once you look at the human lens as between oppressor, isn't a fundamentally biblical way in which you're supposed to encourage behavior between individuals. So it's just simple things that the Bible, again, not being metaphysically or epistemologically skeptical about, or making claim that this is how it's supposed to function anyways.
Yeah, and I think that's where you lose some of those transcendental values that, Anthony, you were talking about. It's actually ironic that we're talking about this, because just this morning, I was reading the Beatitudes and the passage Luke 6, where Jesus is discussing, teaching what you were just mentioning, Logan, which is, basically treat others how you'd want to be treated, and even going beyond that and praying for your enemies. And so I think in the context of in oppressor relationship, I mean, you can apply, when someone takes your coat, give them your shirt too. It's the response. Okay, even if we assume that, even if we assume this is the relationship, right? This class of people, or this group of people, is oppressing the other. So we could, for example, do the Egyptians and the Hebrews, or the Israelites. Even given that situation, as Christians, there's a certain way that we're called to respond in that situation that CRT does not adhere to. And so you see that this clear contrast, for example, with cancel culture, with slandering and violence, and there's just so many case examples of this with the protests, and so not only is the very outlook of the reality of it is this group oppressed or not, but even given those circumstances, how as Christians do we respond to that? That is very, very different.
Well, Josh, okay, there's the good question. And again, let me run that. Let's run this through the Romans 1:18 through 32 worldview again. And I'd reference, can't remember what chapter Script Tape Letters it is, but, Lewis makes it clear, Lewis, putting this idea of oppressor and oppressed, into the, this correspondence between the elder tempter Screwtape and the younger tempter Wormwood, and says this is the fundamental problem. I'm willing to accept that the fundamental problem is one of oppressor and oppressed. The problem is when we misidentify who or what the oppressor is, and who the oppressed are. If you get rid of the transcendental either values or entities, Josh, then you got to find an oppressor and oppressed in the immanent frame, to reference Charles Taylor. You got to find the oppressive group. You got to find the oppressed group, because there's no Satan, there's no demons, there's no spiritual powers or principalities, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, or elemental forces of the airs that are doing that to you, right? And there's no such thing as sin that's doing that to you.
Yeah.
So you have to immanentize the oppressor. You have to, and now look, are there? Yes, the Nazis were actual oppressors. The white slave masters were actual concrete oppressors. The Ottoman Turks were really, really, really bad oppressors. Just to throw one more cultural group in there that was horrible. So, yeah, but at the end of the day, if you eliminate anything like a spiritual reality or any transcendent justice to go along with it, then you best be finding why you're feeling oppressed, imminently, right? So, and because I think the oppressor-oppressed dynamic is part of the fundamental Christian story. That seems obvious because it's Christ who liberates us from that dynamic. But if you don't have Christ in the center of that, or those transcendental realities or values.
Yeah. Well,
right.
I think that's the important part. What you just said, Tony, this transcendent values is the Bible is operating in a lot of these ethnic, cultural, oppression relationships. If it's the Egyptians, if it's the Romans, if it's whatever's going on, there's a ton of examples. But the Bible is always careful to make two things clear. One is that the oppressor is a transcendent value, and there's an individual, and there's the demonic realm, and so on and so forth. But then also the savior side is not, the critical race theorist, the social justice warrior. God's the savior. So the savior is also not, made immediate within our culture or within our circumstance. And then Paul hashes that out every time. Paul isn't the one coming to save people. I mean, it's a perfect example, like with the Jewish Jesus and the Roman centurion, right? He's talking about, wow, this guy, the oppressor. Here's an individual, because the Roman isn't the oppressor necessarily, but here's an example of someone who had the faith. Or even with Pharisees, Jesus ripped into the Pharisees at every opportunity, and then Paul, who was a Pharisee, goes on to write most of the New Testament. So it's like you have to take the transcendent value going on.
One of the examples that I'll throw in is Zacchaeus. If we see Jesus goes into his house, he recognizes that he's part of an oppressive system and he'd been oppressing people. As he encounters Jesus, he is taking an action to actually recognize his mistakes and find ways to actually mend it. But one thing that we don't see there is Jesus asking him to leave his profession and follow him. I think that is expected of him now that he goes back to this trade or the system that he is in and makes the difference there. Right? It's not dismantling the whole system. He's as much as questioning the Pharisees, who is questioning Jesus for actually going to Zacchaeus' house, as much as he's questioning Zacchaeus' act of oppression against the other. So there is this need to recognize the importance of Christ in our life, for the fact that we recognize our mistakes and our wrong intentions and work with them within the system that we are part of, not just dismantling it completely.
Well, I think it's insightful what you just said, Jacob, about the dismantling part, because any attempt that we know of dismantling an unjust system and saying, oh, we're just going to institute a new one that's just, runs into either the exact same problems or worse problems, because the new system that's being in place has no connection to the culture or the people that the system's been put in. If you look at modern times United States nation building project, if it's the CCP's overtaking of Chinese tradition, if it's India in relationship to England, I mean, anytime they've said, okay, we can put a better system in, it's always at the expense of the people who are supposed to benefit. And then it ends up collapsing usually fairly quickly. There has to be some sort of, I don't want to put too many extra biblical principles, but there is wisdom in saying, hey, okay, you have to do what's best with what God has given you in the circumstances that you're placed, not, okay, guys, I have this really good government system. If we just overthrow the Roman Empire, Christ isn't doing that, because he's not saying this is how you save humanity through this new government system.
Well, oh boy, there's a couple things I want to say. Let me just get out quickly. One is I do see CRT as having elements of, because I think, Josh, you mentioned something about this, sort of elements of Gnosticism, right? There's a sort of a secret knowledge. There's an awakening that's supposed to happen where at least the white person realizes how corrupt they are, etc. And then I think what we've just sort of laid out is there's also an element of Pelagianism. There's sort of an atonement that can be done apart from God on my own strength if I just make the right sort of sacrifices and propitiations, right? And I honestly, like, if you go back to this summer when you saw the mayor of Minneapolis sort of walk into that crowd of Black Lives Matter protesters and sort of obsequiously sort of offer up his apologies as a white man, well, I think you saw what the human response to that looks like, right? Like, so it looked like, I mean, of course, this guy's a politician, so we don't know how genuine the propitiation was, but you can go back and watch the video to see what the response to that sacrifice was. It's basically, get the hell, take your propitiation, get the hell out of here.
His name was Jacob, so that's
Yeah.
Well, that's where, I mean, when you have
Right.
this strict identitarian
Yeah.
views, oppressor, you don't see a fluid movement between the two. It's a lens by which you have identified this part of society and that part of society. And the important part, as you said, a tax collector isn't just on the oppressed side, and he has to live in that guilt and sin for the rest of his life. Yeah. Or, you know, if it was Paul, or, I mean, Paul's a great example of this, where, you know, if anyone marked all the bad things in the oppressor relationship, Paul was at the top, and he gives his credentials that made him at the top. And then you see him, you know, writing the New Testament and having a total like the conversion story doesn't make sense in an oppressor lens. And I think that if you don't have that, you don't have the gospel.
Right.
One of the common things that we find in the gospel is that during the life of Christ, is there is this attempt, even on the part of disciples here and there, to actually grab this power position, you know, as opposed to
James and John, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And Jesus is always resisting that. He is never letting that happen, to the point that the very first miracle we see, that disciples come and make the, you know, he's not letting them have that. He's saying that it's in my time, in my way, it's going to happen, and he does it, right? So ultimately, in light of the injustices, I think what we need to recognize is that the only dignifier that truly dignifies human beings is Christ, right? It's not a system, it's not an individual. We may be part of a collective that might in some way seem like oppressive in some nature, but we need to recognize our mistakes and come to Christ, who dignifies us. He dignifies both. That's the beauty of Christian faith. He dignifies the oppressor and the oppressed together in a way that glorifies God at the end, not pitting each other against each other. So,
right.
Yeah, I think even when you talk about that, there was a documentary that I watched for some research I was doing for Rosemead, and I can't recall the name of it, but basically it was talking about they were interviewing different people who had been in sex trafficking, and so they were interviewing Johns, they were interviewing the prostitutes, they were interviewing the pimps, and at the end of it, you just see you see the prostitutes, and they're talking about the redemption in Christ from their old life, and then you see the former pimp also talking about redemption as well, and I think that's what, like, there's no talk. If you want to talk about inclusive, CRT is the exact opposite of inclusive. In Christianity, the oppressor, the oppressed, all are welcome in Christ as long as they receive him. And and the guy in the video makes an interesting comment. He says something along the lines of, you know, the prostitute was you know, a victim, and I was the one that was, you know, the perpetrator. But he's like, ultimately, he's like, we were both basically the subject to sin. And I think that's when you remove that element of it, you elevate the oppressed to this righteousness, this level, this person who is owed something, and they can receive this salvation out, you know, by their own means, I guess, or by the atonement of the oppressor, depending on what narrative you're going with. And then on the other end, you have the person who is the oppressor, and for them there just is no salvation. In fact, the only answer for the oppressor is we need to take you down, we need to cancel you, we need to destroy you. And so and in Christianity you don't have that. You have redemption for all. And so I think in because of that it is antithetical to the gospel.
Yeah, that's good, John. I mean, I'm I've been wanting to shift the conversation. This is speculative, but I've been on this train of thought because you brought up an example of how you have particularly in the arena of human sexuality, right? One of the most devastating forms of it, sex trafficking and the use of human bodies for mere sexual pleasure, and how two people in that context both get redeemed in Christ, but both knew that they were sinners and subject to sin, as you said. And I want to make 2 points. One, that I also think critical race theory, because I think it's also a political, when the boots hit the ground, it is a political movement, because there's going to be political action behind these theories that are calling for certain things to happen, right? And this came up in the interview that Al Mohler had with Glenn Lowry about subsidiarity. Jacob, you know what I'm talking about. This idea that when something's broken at the smallest level of human relationship and interaction, successive larger components of human society cannot really fix the thing that gets broken at the most intimate level, right? And this is something that every single one of the more conservative Black academics that we've been referencing, from Shelby Seal to Glenn Lowry, keep pressing, and it's very unpopular. They literally are putting their necks out on the line, their credentials, their reputations, in saying that whatever you do at government, it's not going to fix the Black family. The Black family is broken. And this applies, though, to, I think, this just applies universally. This is just irregardless of race. What happens in the family cannot be fixed by some higher level of society, although we as the church say that's where the church does come in as the spiritual family, when the biological family is broken, and sometimes broken horribly. And the biological family is most horribly broken when there's sexual sin. I mean, to me, that's an obvious truth, right? Child abuse, sexual abuse, adultery, infidelity in marriage. These, human sexuality, I mean, and again, I'm speculating here, but I've really been thinking about this a lot, far more fundamental than our race. Okay. And I think it shouldn't surprise us when we see, together with every social justice movement that is calling for racial reconciliation or racial justice, there's always an element of sexuality attached to that. Gender is LGBTQ, and it seems to me that the more fundamental push here is for more like sexual liberation. I mean, at the end of the day, and I think, Logan, I don't know if you read is it Angela Davis, who was the pupil of Herbert Marcuse, who I think coined the term critical race theory, an avowed Marxist, but she learned much from Marcuse, and Marcuse's whole push was sexual liberation. That is where the rubber hits the road with regards to how we can be fulfilled apart from, God, heaven, spiritual goods, because those things don't exist.
Yeah.
And
we'll continue. There's a point that I want to make right here. Let me just bookmark that, but continue.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, to me, there's a connection here between race and sexuality. And really what I think the agenda that's ultimately is being driven and that's going to win out is not so much about racial reconciliation, because that could be done without the critical theory part, right? That was being done in the civil rights movement. There was a road that was progressing towards racial reconciliation and justice. Why does that get taken out? Why does Martin Luther King's vision no longer count as the right way forward on racial reconciliation? But the new way forward is the way forward of Black Lives Matter, a group that was started by 3 lesbian women, as far as I know. Maybe they're not all lesbian, but 3 women. And when I read some Black theologians like Willie James Jennings in his book After Whiteness, when he defines what he means by whiteness, and I'll just read it here. Whiteness is white, self-sufficient masculinity. And what I really think is the Trojan horse here is not that there's really an interest in racial reconciliation, because we were on that road. We were getting there. But this is really a liberation from gender roles, the structures that God has put in place, like maleness, femaleness, marriage, right? The nuclear family, which of course we know was on the Black Lives Matter website until they took it down. That this is really the more fundamental issue, is this is a means through which we can be liberated from, in our human sexuality. Because ultimately that's what gives us pleasure, not race. I mean, me being white or somebody being black, our skin color doesn't give us any pleasure, right? So I kind of went off on a tangent there, but I mean, I think at the end of the day, what is being pushed here is a sexual liberation. And just Josh bringing up that concrete example of how Christ redeems, our sexuality as well and our sexual sins. I think that's been rejected. I think that's the bigger story out there that's being rejected, because those are fundamental structures that God has put in place. The Bible doesn't say in the beginning God created black and white in his image. He created them black and white. It says in the beginning he created them male and female. In his image he created them. So anyways, I went a little tangent.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think you're right. I was listening to Dr. Azrad. He was a former, I don't know if he's still at the Heritage Foundation or not, but he's with Hillsdale College and with the Claremont Institute as well. He thinks that a lot of what's happening now started with not just the Frankfurt School, but also having elements from Freud in his work, Civilization's Discontents, which is built on what you said, this idea of civilization being sexually repressive and how all these things come about. And Freud makes some interesting arguments about how if you want to have civilization, you have to make sacrifices. You can't just live however you want and live in society. There's rules. And so it's a little nuanced, but there's a very strong sexual element, specifically sexual oppression, that develops and brings. So I think you're right on that. But I think what's interesting is when you talked about a lot of these Black academics and them risking their lives and talking about the subsidiarity and
I don't know if they're risking their life. They're risking their academic.
Yeah, exactly. Reputation, those things, not necessarily being killed or anything like that, but their academic reputation, their financial stability, those sorts of things. The question is, what are they saying? And it's not just this idea that the family needs to be coherent, but they go a step further very often, if it's specifically Soul or even Steele. And I was listening even to Denzel Washington even goes, not as far explicitly, but you can see where he's pushing, because he'll make these rhetorical questions about, are you really saying it's the system that says I can't walk in the south side of Chicago at night? Is that what we're really saying? So you'll see stuff like this, but what Soul and Steele explicitly will say is, wait a minute, when we talk about what's considered a successful Black achievement, if we want to talk about education, if we want to talk about divorce rate, if we want to talk about this, why was it during the civil rights era or just before Martin Luther King, they were doing really well? And what Steele would go on very explicitly to say is, despite how bad it was, and Steele is very clear as being the oppression that was going on, he lived through a lot of that era, his parents were actively involved. He said the Blacks had a strong sense of family identity because that's all they had. and the business structure. He said, when our community was suffering, my parents went and built the credit unions and built the banks and built the business relations, because that's all that we had. If we wanted to succeed, we had to do it on our own. And it wasn't until, and Steele's going to argue, this moral authority comes in. Who has moral authority and where does it come from, and the Great Society and all that kind of stuff. But he says, once we said, okay, people owe us and they have to take care of us, we're not responsible for keeping a group identity, we're not responsible for our family, for our businesses, that's when it all fell apart. And then Black culture just got destroyed and decimated. The left doesn't want to hear that, but Lowry will say this, Stoll will say this, Steele will say this, McWhorter will say this, that Riley will say this. Accountability, all that went out the window, and it started in the family. Once the family could say, actually, the government owes us stability, that destroyed it. And the whites were very happy, and this is Steele saying, because then they could atone for their racist past, and we go on with destroying the Black family and having this moral high ground, however you want to cash that out. So it's very fascinating. But that's the controversy, is they're saying, well,
and I'll say to your first point about Freud's magnum opus, right, Civilization Discontents, Marcuse's answer to that was Eros in Civilization, where he was trying to wed Freud and Marx together. And he thought, where Freud thought the id, if you unleashed the libidinal energies, right, especially the male libidinal energies, it would destroy civilization. Marcuse thought this was possible, that we could have this sort of free sex culture, and that would actually change us as people. We would actually recreate the human person. And I think the bigger, and I'm wondering, again, it's speculative, but I think when you get to guys like Lowry and Steele, these guys are probably going to advocate for, the nuclear family as the building block for any healthy culture or civilization.
Oh, they do it explicitly.
Okay.
It's Black family.
This is regardless of race.
The problem.
The race is downstream from that, but that is fundamentally a sexual issue then. Because
if we're interested in empirical statistics, we just only have to look at the immigrant families. Not just that, you just look at the South American and Caribbean Blacks who come to America and are successful, equally successful than any white person or any immigrant, because of the very fact that they're tight-knit nuclear families. They take care of, and so that does inform in terms of their public behavior, in terms of their aspiration, in terms of achieving what they want to in life.
Yeah, and then you have, again, downstream for what Tony was saying and going with Jacob, you have, I think it's Friedan, she ends up writing in The Feminine Mystique, where she basically just calls the family a comfortable concentration camp. Like, it's not just, if we just sexually liberate, it's a very anti-family structure. Get rid of the family, we'll have a free society. And the places that we've gotten rid of the family or have said there's no accountability sexually, like with who you have sex with, the consequences of sex, it's just destroyed those individuals' lives.
Mm-hmm. And now you're even saying, just the other day, something called, I don't know if you guys have heard of the concept called mating. Have you heard of that? It's like a new thing they're doing where essentially you find someone who's a good potential mate to parent with. Meaning you take out all of the intimacy between the spouses. You find someone who's a good candidate to rear a child with, and the goal is to basically do a non-traditional, non-nuclear family unit where you can get together with someone for a time to procreate. Right, you have a kid, and then whether or not you want to raise them together is dependent upon the couple, but it's removing. I'm seeing more of a shift in society where you're removing not even just the people who God has ordained for those roles in the family unit, right? Like a mother and a father, but also even the ways in which they're supposed to come together and be wed is being attacked. And so to I guess even go further, I think, Tony, with your point, not only is this not just about race and about sex, but I think even maybe still a level lower than that, really it's about destroying the I think at its core, it's about destroying intimacy and destroying the family. And I think that's really that's ingenious, really, from Satan's perspective. It's ingenious tactic.
Well, and I think too, Josh, it's also about something like just again mapping human life onto something like a pleasure pain metric, where the highest good is whatever that maximizes pleasure, and the biggest evil is whatever allows any modicum of pain. Because it's like, how can we construct a society where we just avoid suffering? Right. So you avoid all of the horrors, not the horrors, but the trials of parenting. Right.
Yeah.
All the
Totally.
struggles, all the strife that comes with that. And I think what ultimately is going to happen, and what already has happened, is you produce incredibly what's the word? Shallow and not very virtuous citizens. Because and look, it's happening. We see it with the coronavirus. I think Jonathan Haidt coined the term safetyism. We're getting to the point where through technology, we think we can create a world where we're hermeneutically sealed off from real pain and suffering, whether it be physical or emotional, because we don't think those things can really be redeemed, either in this life or the next. And again, it's a throwing out of the transcendent. And I'm worried about the church in times like this with critical race theory, and also we talked about COVID last time, not being able to point people to the transcendent goods that we lay all of our hopes on ultimately, and just becoming sort of more of a source for information, how you can better improve your life down here. But we already have health services for that. What do we need the church for? To sort of spin off of something that I think the author Tom Holland was saying. Why do I need the church to act like another National Institute of Health ministry, that can tell me how to best arrange my life? I need something eternal, to pin my hopes on. But yeah, so all of the above with regards to why I think at the end of the day, it's destroying intimacy, it's division at the heart of godly structures, and what the desire is from us is to avoid pain, avoid suffering, avoid problems.
Yeah, and the result of that is like you said, you said lack of virtue. I mean, right, with safetyism, for example, you're going to have a lack of courage. You're going to have a lack of, because when you try to, and I think you're spot on, Tony, with what you just said. When you have a world that's attempted to being where the goal is to just eliminate suffering, so you don't have to deal with it, just avoid pain, rather than responding to pain in the way that Christ responded to it. There are so many effects from that. For example, not even just courage, but also selfishness. You can be selfish in your avoidance of pain and just transfer it to the next person. Oh, I don't want to deal with it, so let me just have you deal with that instead. There's so many different I think vices that can breed from that, and the Christian life isn't about avoiding pain or avoiding suffering or doing just what makes us most comfortable. It's about entering into the pain and Christ being with us in the midst of it. And so again, just as we're talking about this, just more and more, I'm just seeing more and more antitheses to the Christian narrative.
I mean, I've seen articles online by, I think, non-Christian people who embraced critical race theory, and it seems like the attacks ultimately will have no end point. One can just see biracial friendships ending, biracial marriages potentially being ended, because who knows, the white husband might have married his black wife because secretly he wanted to, exert his dominance over a black person. And that maybe that, the person never had a thought like that in his mind or in his heart, but because this is a reified and objectified in virtue of just having the involuntary properties of being white, then it must just be the case that the white friend is using the black friend, and the white maybe the white wife is using the black husband. You could just see how corrosive this could be to intimacy. I mean,
and what stops it from going further into devolving again into this sort of tribalism, where right now the hot ones are race and gender and sexual orientation. But then we could just add on things. People wearing glasses, or there's so many different ways you
Jacob
can slice
Jacob and I can stay friends if I go out and to the beach over the summer and get a nice tan. Then
I'm not wearing my glasses today.
We'll be equals.
Oh yeah.
Almost as dark as
that was in reference to you, Jacob, because you didn't have them on. So,
but I'm never gonna get as dark as my friend from Kenya. Man, I don't know how I'll do that. So,
well, and I think for the audience, what should at least be going to the back of the mind is, if CRT was just a methodological lens for looking at the world, all of these discussions wouldn't be happening. No one's having these discussions about Newtonian physics or the definition of a virus, or is the quantum mechanics going to change marriage intimacy. It's like, I don't understand the defense from the social scientists. It's just an objective lens because it's obviously destructive. And this goes back to, again, when we open up with the seminary presidents and Phil, the back and forth, they just know what they're talking about. They're dealing with it in the church and in the seminary. They're saying, we have to reject this because it's antithetical to the gospel in all of these ways.
Yeah.
And the only way we can actually speak out, I think, the reason a lot of Christians are keeping silent is because I think we are failing to see and understand human reality and our story in light of the ascension and cessation of Christ at the right hand of God. Yep. What we are doing is actually, we are giving into fear. We know the truth, but we are not seeing it in light of the victory that Christ has already taken over this. If we see it through the light of Christ's claim that all authority in heaven and earth is given to me, so go therefore, right? If we do that, I think we'll fight well and win it, because we hold on, we got to hold on to the promise in the scripture of positive eschatology, if I may put it that way, and move with that attitude. If not, then it's going to be detrimental.
Right. And I was just thinking, let's do this. Let me just, because I think we've covered a lot of territory here, but I think we know what, and this is why, one of the things that has come out in discussion, the idea of critical race theory acting as a religion and people being sort of fanatical hangers on to this adherence of this religion. Because we know what's going to happen if this video goes around. Anybody who's embraced this is going to say, well, you guys just see, you're all white, and Jacob, you've accepted whiteness. you guys, the other response would be, oh, you've totally misunderstood the view. You haven't either understood Robin DiAngelo or you haven't read enough critical race theorists. And if you just read one more or two more or 20 more books, then you'll get it.
So who decides that I need to be oppressed by? So who decides that I need to be oppressed by you or DiAngelo?
I don't know. Yeah, right. Right, exactly, because she's as white as the snow. Yeah. I was going to say that
it is funny that most of these avidly anti-CRT people happen to be non-white, which is funny in the scheme of things when the group of people they're claiming to help. A lot of the most accomplished people in that group are the ones saying this is not helping us, and anyone who believes this wouldn't end up where.
And this is also true with regards to our petition to Biola when we came out with the public petition.
Yeah.
good number of them, if not majority, good number of them were people of color signing it.
Right. Right. No, we'll have to embrace for the white, usually the white person who has accepted this, to tell us how dumb we are and how we haven't read enough and all this, and or that we just have our implicit bias and we just haven't been woken up in the sort of Gnostic way. Now,
Yeah,
I
I think
want to
that's
make
more likely.
room for something though, and this is just, look, to bring it down to the more personal level. So again, let's not make a doctrine out of this. It's speculative. But look, I grew up in the South Side of Chicago, Roman Catholic. And I always had friendships and relationships with black guys and Hispanic guys and Asian guys. Just grew up that way. I grew up in that kind of environment. And I didn't grow up with this white evangelicalism for sure, because again, I was Catholic through and through. And there might be some significant differences there. Look, I don't know. I just don't know the history of this. There may be a lot of white evangelicals who grew up, especially in the southern states, who are maybe just more susceptible to this because they do feel like they never had friendships, close relationships with black people, with Hispanic people. I don't want to over psychoanalyze, right? We all hate that where you think you can figure people out. We accept the fact that human beings are incredibly complex and to some degree mysterious. But it may be the case that you do have a large portion or some portion of the evangelical church in America that has suffered under a lack of having good relationships with black people, people of color. I don't know. And then those people are especially open to the D'Angelo rhetoric, if you will, or the Kindi rhetoric. And maybe they really feel they do need to make some kind of atonement. And some of them are academic.
Well, I think what you just said, Tony, is... Well, I think what you said is super important, because if you read through any of the philosophers, theologians, even a lot of the older psychologists. I just finished a book reading A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and he has this little section where he's like, I feel like a lot of the quote unquote psychological problems that he was dealing with post Holocaust, he's like, it's just people need friends. He's like, that's not a psychological problem. You just need friends and the importance of friendship. And this might go back to what you were saying a little while ago, Tony, is we just have sexualized friendships. You don't have a rigorous understanding of friendship in this kind of, C.S. Lewis has a very high view of friendship as being not necessary for existing, but necessary for making existence worth having. The camaraderie, that's fallen apart by and large. And now there may be a racial dimension because certain friendships were never developed, but yeah, the friendship and the sexualizing, and I think you're onto something, is what I'm saying, whether or not we take that as doctrine going forward. But there's a lot of people who've seen this, that the breakdown of friendships lead to what some people think are psychological problems, but they're just, you have no friends, which some people don't want to hear, but is important.
Yeah, and being part of a group, I think there is a need for every individual to think for themselves. And that's necessary, and come to their own conclusion about ideas like this. Collective thinking might be good in some case, but not in every case. Thinking for oneself, and because we need to understand that ideas do have consequences. In that regard, CRT has a lot of consequences, and people need to be thinking. It is, in my opinion, if you ask me as a person of color, I think it can bring one into a place. And let me give you this example if we have time, I don't know. Coming from an Eastern context, from a system that has a lot of hierarchy, and I've seen a lot of oppression, physical as well as emotional oppression, someone who has witnessed it. With regards to the caste system, what people have done is that they have created a system of dividing people on the basis of their caste. But in doing so, people have bought into this transcendent idea that they got to remain in their caste and their own culture, their way of thinking. And in doing so, they remain in their place of either oppressing the other or being oppressed by the other, because they are bought into this higher idea. And I think critical theory, in some regard, functions in that way, even though it promises to lift you up, but it doesn't deliver it. And that's where the danger is.
Well,
I got that note.
yeah. I want to reference, and I haven't finished this book yet. Again, After Whiteness, we can provide a link. And look, it's not all bad. I mean, this is a very smart Yale theologian, always going to have something good to find with somebody who works at that level. Very, some really good things to say. But, one of the things that I'm wondering about in the book, and again, I already pointed out that he includes masculinist as a core feature of whiteness, which again strikes me as a sort of and self-sufficiency as core features of what whiteness is. And one of the things that keeps struggling me is just the use of the term whiteness at all. Because as I read through the book, and it's not like an analytical work of philosophy, it's almost written poetically, a lot of first person stories, and him sort of as an academic being, him having seen theological education over the years being imbued with whiteness, this idea of self-sufficient masculinity. What's interesting though is that he just doesn't, he calls it whiteness, and people use the term whiteness when I don't know why they can't just say something like Eurocentric enlightenment rationalism. Because it seems to me a lot of the critique is against something like Eurocentric enlightenment rationalism and maybe individualism, which are all concepts and ideas that could be justifiably critiqued from a biblical worldview, but then it gets called whiteness. And that's where my old army BS meter starts kicking in. Like, why use that term when you could use a more deflated term that you could get all white people to come on board with and say, yeah, let's take a look at rationalism, individualism, post-enlightenment thinking, and how maybe that deviated from the gospel. Now, maybe I'm totally reading this wrong, but it seems to me that that's kind of the thing that he has in view, but then he calls it whiteness, which then when you call it that, how can you, and you can't help but sort of feel like you're sort of accusing people. And I worry about this almost desire to accuse, or make people at least think you're accusing them. And then say, I'm not really accusing you. It's whiteness. It's more of an abstract thing. But of course, as soon as you start writing books and using words like that, what are people going to think? They're going to feel accused. And I struggle with that. Like, I don't even know why you would do that. Like, I want to get like, what's behind that whole sense of using even terms like whiteness instead of calling it more specifically what it is as an idea, or as a group of ideas that maybe are in some way incompatible with a Christian worldview. So that was just another thing where my antenna raised up and I got like a lot of just more yellow flags.
Well, I think that would be an instant. When you say deflating, I mean, basically what you're saying is, and accusing, you're saying, why can't these terms be more descriptive and less moralizing? It's basically, I mean, what I'm hearing. And so this is what it goes back to the point of, I see this just all being a worldview and worldview building or moralizing. And it doesn't seem like they're interested in descriptive features of the world.
Yeah.
Because there's at bottom, it's a narrative and it's somehow connected to racial identity.
And
which is not
very difficult to also incite emotions. And emotion is a fundamental thing when it comes to activism. And CRT is basically an attempt for activism. I mean, even in our public school today, we are not preparing kids to know about things. We are preparing them to become activists, to bring about, a big idea in the society itself. So
Yeah,
social change.
there is a sense of like where the sort of the method of, or maybe even the ideal of dispassionate analysis is itself under critique. But again, that's where you say, okay, well, there is a legitimacy to critiquing sort of a scientistic rationalism. Fine, right? There's a lot of emotional characters in the Bible. I mean, they're crying all the time. We get it. Like, the emotions are important, but I don't know that that requires us to reject something like a dispassionate analysis for the sake of bringing about some common good. But yeah, this seems to want to go right for the jugular with regards to the emotions, without doing the more long-term analysis, taking the step back to see what might be actually better means. And this is also something we've heard amongst the economists and social scientists that we've referenced here, of stepping back and finding out what the solution to racial injustice is. And the people who are more modernist in their take, even like younger guys like Coleman Hughes, whose name we haven't brought up, but I think he said something like this: hey, I'm just interested in the solution. What's the solution? What works? And they're all saying that critical race theory doesn't work as a viable theory, hypothesis, way forward. So there's even just a practical or pragmatic challenge, I think, that has to be raised against CRT.
I might be the only guy who is optimistic here, but let me say this, that I definitely see an awakening, a right kind of awakening among Christians, among believers, even people, regardless of what color of skin they have, realizing that maybe it was worth trying this out, seeing the product of this whole critical theory in our culture today, though it has expended a lot of emotions and, just even, a lot of trouble in our society today. But we have seen that the emperor is naked. The promises are not being fulfilled. And in a way, this will help us, I hope, if we stay strong and we put our faith in resurrected Christ, but also a Christ who's sitting at the right hand of God, reigning and ruling. If we trust in that and move forward, I think we will fight well.
Well, let's wrap up this session on that very excellent thought. And maybe in the next time we meet, we'll look at some of the things that might, if critical theory were actually put into practice, what might we see or actually call for people to do, and would they actually do it? So let's end it there, and we'll see you next time.